Memory and History in the Contest Between Empire and Liberty. A book reading by Professor Anthony J. Hall from his recently published text, Earth into Property, Colonization, Decolonization and Capitalism, at the Blackfoot Art Gallery and Gift Shop in Lethbridge, Alberta, Canada, January 29th, 2011.
I see this as a kind of community center, and I'm very thrilled to have this opportunity to spend an afternoon with people in the community, and we can relate and talk about what we're working on, our fears, our hopes, our aspirations, our perceptions of history, our perceptions of how history is connected to the future. And before getting right into the reading, I'd just like us to stop and reflect a little bit about the trials and tribulations and the hopes and aspirations of indigenous peoples in Egypt. Right now, people are being murdered, people are being tortured. There is a movement in Egypt to say we are not going to accept this tyranny of a government we did not choose, a government that makes decisions for us that we do not accept. And I asked to reflect who put that government in place that the indigenous peoples of Egypt are trying to displace. Is it similar forces to those who created the process that resulted in the dispossession and marginalization of indigenous peoples in this continent? Hosni Mubarak, some would call him a puppet. Some would call him somebody put in that job to carry out missions and priorities not of the people of Egypt, but of those who are colonizing a part of the world which is very rich in natural resources, which has a lot of oil and gas, as North America is rich in natural resources, as Alberta is rich in oil and gas. Is the exploitation of oil and gas serving the indigenous peoples of Alberta, or is it violating the indigenous peoples of Alberta? I went up to Edmonton with Joshua when James Cameron, the person who made Avatar, came into Edmonton, went up to Fort McMurray to give some kind of balance. His perspective, his perception was that the indigenous people in Alberta are being pushed off to the side, are not having a fair say and a fair share of the decision-making and whatever riches might be emerging from the land. And so he attempted to rectify the situation, to balance it out a little bit more. Now, I can say he's a brilliant man. I can say when I saw Avatar, I saw it just a couple of days after submitting finally the manuscript, and I thought, my goodness, Avatar is kind of the story that flows from the story I've been attempting to tell in The Bowl with One Spoon for 16 years. So I've enjoyed taking part in the contemporary events of my time. I've tried to situate myself in my community with people who are on the move, trying to change history. And so the writing has been an effort at a symbiotic relation with looking at reality, participating in the effort to change history, and realizing over time that a big part of possibly changing history is drawing from history, interpreting history, and explaining the present with a reference to how we got in this situation. So I've got a few choices. It's not set in stone what I'm going to, what pieces I'm going to read. I'll try to read fairly short excerpts. But in line with this idea, how do we look at what's going on in Egypt, for instance? Do we see this as something remote from us, a kind of show or play that we watch on television that really has nothing to do with us? Or do we try to picture ourselves in that same matrix of power and influence that is having negative consequences for the people in Egypt, but negative consequences for other peoples, our brothers and sisters. I think of our brothers and sisters in prison and the disproportionate number of peoples, Native peoples, Indigenous peoples in the prisons in Western Canada. Why is that? How does that situation come into being? I think of 2009, when Joshua and I and Splitting the Sky and others went to Calgary when George Bush was speaking his first speech after his job as President of the United States. And I'm not alone, none of the three people I mentioned are not alone in saying George Bush has a lot to answer for. We have international laws on torture, on aggressive warfare, on genocide. And is the reality that he's brought into Calgary to speak in defiance of all these laws that have been, I'm not going to say he's guilty of this because he hasn't had a trial yet. He's innocent until proven guilty. But, you know, it underlined, especially Splitting the Sky's presence there, that this thing called the rule of law, or law and order, it falls disproportionately on the poor and the marginalized. And those who are rich and powerful seem to be above the law, seem not to be held accountable to the rule of law. And how can that be? Do we really have a rule of law if there is no equitable enforcement? So this idea of considering ourselves in bigger and bigger contexts, let me read from the chapter Memory and History in the Contest Between Empire and Liberty, which is the introductory chapter of Earth into Property. And there's only one illustration in this whole text. I have a number of illustrations in The American Empire and the Fourth World, which is volume 1 of The Bowl with One Spoon. Earth into Property is volume 2 of The Bowl with One Spoon. And both volumes I start with a description, a first-person narrative, writing in I, me, about a road trip. The first road trip being, in volume 1, being a trip to Johnson Hall, where Sir William Johnson had his manor, the first superintendent of Indian Affairs. It's kind of a shrine for me, and I reflected back on my trip there in 1992 with my son Samson. And in the second volume, I start with a narrative of my motorcycle safari around the Ruwenzori Mountains, which are on the border of Uganda and Congo. And in looking back, it occurred to me that this really was the period where I started to think, and I was 19, 20 years old at the time, this reality that so much of history is based on colonization, empire building, imperialism, encountering and sometimes confronting and marginalizing indigenous peoples. So the process that I've been looking at in detail in America, I really had a sort of awakening to those concepts when I was traveling in Africa. And so I reflect back in the introduction of volume 2. And on page 5 I write, we live in a time when the cycles of imperial globalization that have been gathering force since 1492 find expression in the ongoing push to expand and totalize capitalism's preeminence as humanity's sole system of political economy. Never before in history have virtually all branches of humanity been subjected to so much pressure to conform to a single regime of material interaction. As I first began to apprehend during my circumnavigation of the Ruwenzori Mountains, the greatest obstacle to the universalization of capitalism remains the collective propensity of indigenous peoples the world over to resist both the appropriation of their Aboriginal lands and resources and the elimination of their diversity of languages, laws, and institutions. From these deep wells of Aboriginal opposition to growing claims of colonialism emerged rivulets of resistance, which gradually merged to form a rising stream of anti-imperial globalization. There's that term that Joshua raised. imperial globalization, anti-imperial globalization. I see this anti-imperial current as the other side of the massive imperial initiatives whose force became more pronounced after Christopher Columbus began the modern era of globalization. Implanting the cross of his Roman Catholic sponsors on the eastern shores of the Atlantic Ocean, Columbus pointed Western Europe towards history's most ambitious grab for new territories, plunder, and slaves. In Rome, the Vatican sanctioned the imperial claims of Spain and Portugal, as if the Pope was God's chosen lawgiver in the Western Hemisphere. The Protestant powers of Holland and England soon responded by pressing their own counterclaims of dominion to large portions of the so-called New World of America. In their struggle to escape annihilation, subjugation, enslavement, and the theft of their ancestral lands and waters, many indigenous peoples and their allies have tried to broaden the reach of their freedom struggles. As demonstrated in the complex alliances that coalesced around the anti-imperial mobilization led, for instance, by Tupac Amaru, by Tecumseh in Canada, by Toussaint Louverture in what we now call Haiti, by José Rizal in the Philippines, by Mahatma Gandhi in India, by Mao Zedong in China, by Gamal Abdul Nasser in Egypt, by Kwame Nkrumah, Ghana, W.E.B. Du Bois, black intellectual in the United States, Ho Chi Minh, Vietnam, Nelson Mandela, who needs no introduction, Patrice Lumumba, and of course, Leonard Peltier. The world's colonized peoples have tried sporadically to draw unity from their Aboriginal diversity. To achieve this end, the natural enemies of imperialism have had to imagine themselves in larger and larger ways. They have bridged many divides of ethnicity, language, religion, and ideology in order to expand the scope of their confederacies of Aboriginal opposition to the oppressiveness of both colonial and neo-colonial rule.